Hello, I'm Elizabeth Bradley, the Faculty Director at the Global Health Leadership Institute at Yale University. And I'm joined today by David Berg, an organizational psychologist who's a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry. So nice to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Well, I wanted to begin with a big question, and I think it'll take us some time to tease apart. But the question I want to ask is, how do you build organizational effectiveness? And what I mean by organizational is that it could be a hospital, it could be the emergency room, it could be a pharmaceutical company, an insurance company, but it is a defined organization that is trying to execute some work. How do we build that organization to maximize its effectiveness?
Well, it's a big question.
I know.
I will probably answer it differently than other people because as an organizational psychologist, my interest is not so much in using some outcome as a way of defining effectiveness, like you delivered all your packages on time, which could be a measure of effectiveness, certainly a measure of success. What I'm interested in is what were the processes that allowed you and enabled you to deliver all your packages on time, or to have a low infection rate, or any of the number of outcome measures that are measures of success, but not necessarily help you understand how you get there. So when I think about organizational effectiveness from that point of view, which is what are the processes that get you there, I get to a very distilled definition, and then I relate it to everything else that goes on. So the distilled definition is organizational effectiveness varies. That is, it'll go up when the following thing goes up, which is people who are involved in a task meaningfully, as opposed to being informed about a task. People involved in a task who feel able to say what they think and feel, positive and negative, about the task in front of them. That's my one-sentence definition of organizational effectiveness. And the reason I say that is because organizations are defined by coordinating people's efforts. Otherwise, we're just a craft person, a doc alone. A doc in a healthcare system is connected to other people, and the capacity of that system to be effective is, I think, related to the capacity of that system to access information about what's going on and then to make decisions about how to improve or change those things.
But I'm a little confused because if you really say it's about having everybody involved with the task able to say what they think and feel about the task or about each other at all times, and couldn't that really get a team into pretty difficult territory if people really say what they think and feel at all times?
It's crucial when I say about the task. Okay. I'm actually not saying about each other unless there's a reaction to each other that relates to the task. So, for example, it's the classic example about the challenge of doing this is the effect of, for example, hierarchy on the capacity of an organization to do this. So that the expression that it's hard to deliver bad news up the hierarchy, from my point of view, is a statement about the effectiveness of the organization. And if you ask people in senior roles, they'll say one of my biggest challenges is getting people to tell me what they actually think, especially when what they think is critical of what they imagine to be my goal or my objective. And that puts in this case, the senior person at risk for making a bad decision or for coming up with a poor strategy, because people who have other sources of information are unable, unwilling, feel that they can't say what they're thinking and feeling, especially as it relates to up the hierarchy. That's usually negative thought or feeling. So, but it's about the task. It's not, John, I really don't like you. It's, John, I think you don't have all the information about X, and I wouldn't have done Y if I had all the information. Let me tell you what the information is that I have.
So let's take this from, you introduced the idea of hierarchy, so let's take this from being the person at the top of the hierarchy and then being people who are really following that. So first, being at the top of the hierarchy, what can you really do? I mean, what can you do if people sometimes just don't have the courage to tell you what's going on, and you all of a sudden realize that patients have been waiting for hours in the emergency room? No one told you. You have no idea. So I don't know if I ever would have thought of that as an organizational problem. Don't most people think of that as somebody on the team just has a problem? They're not able to tell you the truth.
Yeah. That is the way most people think about it. I don't think about, if you frame it as courage, you're framing it as an individual characteristic, and now you're trying to select people who are courageous. But most of our evidence, right, the Zimbardo experiment,
Tell us about that, the Zimbardo experiment.
So Philip Zimbardo, they just made a recent movie about this, did an experiment at Stanford where he randomly assigned students to roles of guards and inmates. And what essentially was disturbing about it, and not the first thing, but because you don't usually do a role play like this that goes on scheduled to go on for a week and goes on for 3 days and has to be stopped because of how powerfully people take on the roles. What we learned from this is that this is going to be a slight overstatement, but you let me control the conditions, I can probably get anybody to do anything. Which means courage is probably a reflection of the social structure that's been created in the organization rather than a characteristic of the person. If someone is behaving courageously, or more broadly, if you want most of the people in your organization to behave courageously, you're probably going to have to do something with the setting in which they find themselves rather than in selecting quote-unquote courageous people. Okay. That's good and bad news. The good news is you don't have to rely on the tails of the distribution of courage to have people say what they're thinking and feeling. The bad news is your next question is going to be, so what do you do in organizations to make it more likely that people behave quote-unquote courageously?
I actually, before we get there, want to think about what goes wrong in these kinds of situations. So you're the brand new director of a department, and you hear people griping about the department. They don't think it's very good. But you hear it sideways. You hear it from your confidants or a few people. So you decide, let's have a staff meeting. Let's sit down and let's talk it out. Okay, what do you think happens? I mean, that can turn into complete disaster short term.
Well, I actually think the bigger risk is not the disaster that you may be referring to, which is people actually gripe session, right? I don't think a gripe session is the worst case scenario by a long shot, because it depends on what one does with the gripes. The worst problem is if people have gripes and don't say them. Because then you walk out thinking everything's fine, only the processes that got you to call the meeting continue. In your example, what I would diagnose as the problem is the person who called the meeting doesn't understand the threat of hierarchy to organizational effectiveness. We understand the importance of hierarchy in organizational effectiveness. It's the coordination and authority who gets to make decisions that are, but we think that if we sit in a room and other people who report to us are in the room and we say, please tell me what you honestly think, we're going to get what they honestly think, when in fact they may be quite structurally vulnerable in terms of evaluation, pay, future careers. So if I want people who work for me to be able to say what they think and feel about the task at hand, and I'm in a hierarchical relationship with them, I probably can't go in and say, so tell me what you think and feel. I have to think about something else. As an example, if I thought that there was widespread grousing about what's going on in the organization, either about morale or about a decision that we've made, one thing I could do that takes into account that hierarchy is a threat to effectiveness, in the regard of the way I've defined it, is I could walk into a meeting and I could say, I'd like to really know what you think of the decision we just made. I'm going to step out for 15 minutes. I'd like you to cover the board with the pros and cons. No names, just the pros and cons on this task so that we have them accessible to us, especially me, because I'm a little worried that people aren't delivering to me the negative thoughts and feelings given that I'm the boss. So I'm going to walk out and I'll come back in 15 minutes. I want to see what you're thinking. Now, that's not perfect because people have to trust the other people in the room not to squeal to the boss, etc. But it at least acknowledges that hierarchy presents some challenges to organizational effectiveness as opposed to thinking there's no hierarchy, doesn't have that. I can just go and ask you what you think and you'll tell me. So I think it takes thinking about the various challenges, of which hierarchy is one, and there are others.
So it's a really hard task.
It is.
If you're in a situation where you really just are stretched, you don't have a lot of time, but this kind of thing erupts, what's your advice? I mean, do you hold to the practice, or do you say, just a minute, we're going to work on this, but it's going to be a long while? You know, how do you deal with that?
So first thing I would say is, in order to make this a kind of fair discussion intellectually, there's a long tail to not having such conversations also. Meaning that's what most people complain about. They complain about the stuff that nobody's telling them, the grousing that goes on underground so that no light can be shown on it, nothing can't be addressed. So yes, there's potentially a long tail to having such conversations. There's a long tail to not having. Now, in terms of the kinds of scenario you propose, there are two examples I would use, one from the military and one from medicine, which we generally think of as situations, often, not always, but in emergent situations, where things have to be done quickly, and there's some cost to delay. There's some evidence that even in those situations, you try to slow down and solicit from people who are in different parts of the problem, whether it's different parts of the room, or different parts of the battlefield, or different specialties. You try to slow it down in order to solicit their opinions, because you're in worse shape if you don't. And then the question of, will they tell you, and under what conditions will they tell you, which is the real tricky part here. But both of these organizations have also developed something that says, after you're in the emergent situation, you need to try to find time to sit down and say what you thought about what happened. In the military, it's called an after-action review. And of course, in medicine, it's called a mortality and morbidity conference.
Or incident reporting.
Or incident reporting. Although depending on what happens.
It depends what goes on with incident reporting, right?
Now, the struggle is, you can have the meeting, and then the question is, what happens at the meeting? There's so many reports of M&M conferences, morbidity and mortality, where nobody's saying what they're thinking and feeling, in which case taking it offline, out of the emergent situation, to try to understand it, falls prey to the same struggles we were just talking about. What's keeping people from saying what they think and feel, positive and negative? And without that information, an after-action review, a mortality conference, is not terribly useful.